May I start off with a very, very personal question? Monica, why did you want to be a journalist?
Well, for lots of reasons. One, I guess I was pretty outgoing kind of person as a kid growing up. I loved reading. I loved conveying information. I was brought up in a household that was completely addicted to news and current affairs. So, particularly from my father, who was a pretty political beast. And so I grew up listening to news programs, I suppose, and watching news programs, and I just wanted to be one of them reporters, actually. And so very early on in my teens, I joined a group that used to be at the ABC called the Argonauts Club.
Yes.
And I became an Argonaut. And I started to write book reviews. And it was at the kind of very tail end of the Argonauts, but it was a time when if you wrote a halfway decent book review, they would let you come into the ABC studios in Forbes Street and read your book review out on the radio, on the wireless. So it was particularly exciting you can imagine, for a 12-year-old, which is what I was at the time. And I just decided that's what I wanted to be. I wanted to work in radio. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to convey information. I wanted to travel. I wanted to report the world. That was it. So, I was on that track and I was never going to give up. And then leaving school, my father had desperately wanted me to go to university and study, and so I went to Sydney University and I was studying arts law. And after 3 months, I said, you know what, Dale, I really desperately I so desperately want to be a journalist. I'm prepared to be upfront about it and tell you this, despite what might happen to me in doing so. Anyway, so I temporarily left university, got a cadetship at Channel 7, which was then owned by Fairfax. And in fact, I did my cadetship on the very floor where my office is now located.
Synchronicity.
I know.
Yeah.
How about that?
Peter.
I wish I was an Argonaut. So I'm an accidental journalist, really. I came to this country when I was years old from the UK to be a farmer. And but part of the deal I had a scholarship. I was supposed to be a farmer in Western Australia for 6 months, and I was going to go to agriculture college, get a Bachelor of Business. They were going to give me a low-interest loan, and I was going to become a farmer. That was the plan. And, of course, I realized very early on, about 3 months into this practical experience piece, that I was a really useless farmer. I was absolutely, utterly crap with my hands. I accidentally killed livestock, burnt machines, knocked down fences. I mean, I was really, why on earth I actually even thought I could be a farmer, I'd never really fully understood. I was very fortunate because the same place, this was the early 80s, and the same place I was going to do this Bachelor of Business had started this strange degree called a BA in Rural Journalism. So I wrote away to the scholarship that had sent me to WA and said, hey, look, kind of no good at actually being a farmer, but how about I write about it? And luckily they replied and said, oh yeah, okay, that's a good idea. So I did this BA in rural journalism, and my first couple of years I was a rural journalist in Queensland. And then around about 87, the Sydney Morning Herald was looking for a rural reporter, and they called me up and said, do you want a job?
Right. Now we've got you both into the formal structures of being journalists. Isn't it wonderful how the varied backgrounds that they come from, which shows, I think, these days particularly, this is a personal comment, but how important it is for journalists, like members of Parliament, to be actually part of the real world before they go into a profession. Okay. Just a comment, sorry about that. Let's get into the definition of what a journalist is these days and how it's actually changing. Stephen Cole, who's the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who writes for The New Yorker, said last week that to define what a journalist is these days is very difficult because of the challenges posed by social media and the debate as to whether people like Julian Assange actually are journalists. So his definition of what a journalist is today is how you conduct yourself and who you are affiliated with professionally, forgive me. So can we unpack that? How you conduct yourself and how has that changed and why?
Well, I mean, I think defining what a journalist is very, very difficult, and I think the Assange problem, so to speak, is really just a very recent manifestation of the problem. I think the problem with the question has been one that has been present for probably upward of 10 years now. So Assange aside, because that is quite controversial. I mean, personally, being out there, I think he is a purveyor of information, has been a purveyor of information of a very critical nature that has had public interest attached to it, and therefore ought to be classified as a journalist. And I think it's in the best interests of journalism and journalists globally that he is. But that's, I think, a separate issue. I think the definitional problems associated with journalism have gone back for 10 years or so, and they are a manifestation of the disruption heaped upon the industry by the internet. But broadly speaking, what is a journalist? I mean, I think it's a threatened species. I think a journalist is one who may or may not have had specific training in the art of journalism, who is loosely prepared to abide by a set of rules or ethical parameters which have no sanctions attached, so failing to apply them or live by them carries no particular sanction. And so therefore anybody can put their hand up and say, I'm a journalist. I mean, the industry, we've never ever defined at a union level, and I'm looking at you, Jim, here, but we've never really defined at a union level what a journalist is. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the problem.
And Peter, you've worked for many masters. How important is it who you are affiliated with in terms of defining yourself as a journalist?
So I see, in a sense, think of it this way, journalists have a kind of duality. There's a lot of dualities in journalism, but the key dualities is that as a journalist working for, it doesn't matter who, Rupert, John Fairfax, ABC, it doesn't really matter who or what, there's this duality. One is you are working for a company that pays you. So there's an employer-employee relationship. And there's a set of expectations that come with that, as with any employee-employee relationship. But where journalism differs from most other professions is, not all, but most, is this other notion of serving the public. So you're working in public interest at the same time as you're working in a commercial setting, or in the ABC, in the ABC's case, not quite, but similar. So you have this duality. So I think the notion of what is a journalist is contested now for the reasons that Monica's mentioned. I, by the way, say I don't believe Julian Assange is a journalist, but anyway, that's perhaps put that to one side. But,
it's a hot topic.
Because I don't think he has an ethical basis for what he does. But anyway, that's another question. I do think journalists do not exist in a vacuum, and journalists actually have a set of ethical standards that serve the notion of being a journalist, right? I mean, so how do you work in the public interest if you don't have a notion of what that looks like? So I think, what do journalists do is another way of thinking about this. Journalists do many things. I mean, journalists do, in some ways, what this fine organization does. Journalists seek to build bridges, right, to mutual understanding. Journalists take loads and loads of abstract thoughts and turn them into narratives, into stories. Journalists pick facts. I think one of the key things that journalists do is to take us all individually beyond the limitations of our own experiences. So a journalist working in Syria at the front line near the war can explain to us what it's like to be in Syria. That is a massive role of a journalist. Journalists are bloodhounds, they're watchdogs, and they create, in a more theoretical sense, this idea of a public space, this public square.
Journalists are also under attack. I'm thinking Trump has referred to journalists as enemies of the people. Mm. And last year, and also, it's not just journalists and people like Trump, it's governments around the world. For instance, last year, 348 journalists were imprisoned, 80 reporters were killed, and a further 60 were held hostage. Not much of a safe career, is it? In Australia, we have the problem that journalists rank in the bottom third of trustworthy professions, along with those state and federal politicians, car and real estate salesmen. Although, to be fair, newspaper journalists fare somewhat better. I think they're in the top 2/3 rather than the bottom third. And for many years, students with very high TR scores have been trying to get into university journalism courses like UTS, which is probably the premier journalism course in the country. So obviously students are seeing it as desirable, but overall, how valuable is the community seeing journalism?
I think that the community does value journalism and quite highly. I sense now a real frustration in the community in general at the amount of unfiltered, sometimes uninformed and uneducated information that comes at people from a variety of sources. And so I think there could be a little bit of a turning of the tide where we're becoming more appreciated, more tolerated. But of course that depends on how much trust we can engender in what we do, which is based on how much integrity we can bring. Peter talked before about one of the defining characteristics of journalists being that they adhere to a public interest value in what they do. That the public interest informs and drives what they do. I'd love to think that was the case. I think often it's not, and I do think that is largely a factor of where a journalist works and how they come to be there, because we're not one kind of tribe, we're not one breed. But I think that by and large, one of the positive byproducts of the digital era, as we become more and more digitised, if you like, is that people are becoming more discerning about what they consume. And so therefore information that has been filtered and analysed and gone through the prism of journalism, particularly journalism that is motivated by the public interest, is more valued. Now we've just got to get people to be more willing to pay for it. They're becoming more and more willing to pay for it, but to be even more willing to pay for it.
And that's a beautiful segue to Peter, of course.
Getting people to pay for it.
Yes.
So I think several ways of thinking about journalism. One of them is journalism a service, right? So let's say it is a service. It actually creates a notion of public wealth, if you like. Or there's an external byproduct of journalism that is greater than the investment it takes to create journalism, right? So that is true of all good journalism, right? That the idea that there's a public externality. So the question that I think we've got to confront, and we have to confront this now, whereas we didn't have to for about 100 years. So we had a business model in which advertisers paid to be in the same place that you were, reading or watching the news. That was the business model. We can unpack that a little bit because it was never as pure as we like to think as journalists. But nonetheless, advertisers paid to be in the same space. So if someone bought a front page at the Sydney Morning Herald, and the notion was everyone read every story on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald, therefore the ad got seen as well. That was the business model. That blew up 15, 20 years ago now, a long time ago now, really, when you think about it. So therefore we had to redefine what it is that journalists do and how we value it. And this is the challenge to all of us in this room, that if journalism is a service, if it actually has a positive externality and it has a positive impact on your life, then are you prepared to pay for it? It's the fundamental question of our time in terms of journalism. And so people might say, well, I pay for it because I pay my taxes and that tax money goes to the ABC. Sure. So if you only want to have a world full of the ABC, we'll just keep doing that. I really think that there's
a great idea.
Well, the ABC types in the room will definitely say that, but I wouldn't. I do believe that.
I was joking.
No, you are. But I do believe that We need a diversity of view, a diversity of news media in this country, because we're all better served for it. And therefore, we have to find out new ways of paying for it. Now, there are a few that are going around. All of them, in effect, end up being your responsibility. One way or another, the new business models of journalism are all about the audience. Are you a subscriber? Are you prepared to subscribe? Are you prepared to donate? You know, The Guardian has been very successful basically begging, and its begging model is working, right? Are you prepared to be a member, or whatever that means, but there are various membership models. Are you prepared to pay on an article-by-article basis? There are models out there for that. So there's all various models out there, but ultimately it boils down to, do you value journalism as a service? Which goes back to your initial question, because maybe we haven't got what is journalism right, because if not enough people buy it, because you wouldn't expect to walk downstairs to the cafe and get a free coffee, would you? So why would you expect to get a free story?
Mm-hmm. And that brings us very nicely to this whole problem of the sort of stories that journalists are able to provide these days. I'm quoting Stephen Coll again, the Pulitzer Prize winner, in the West, the rise of national security intrusions is trumping citizens' rights to privacy. And he says that since WikiLeaks, a record number of journalists have been prosecuted. And of course, we've got here in Australia the examples of Annika Schmethurst having her underwear drawer gone through, the ABC being invaded by the Australian Federal Police, and the unbelievable sight of our commercial and ABC media chiefs getting together and as one saying that all the measures the current government is mooting have a very chilling effect on whistleblowers. And whistleblowers are the people that journalists absolutely rely on, in many cases, to find out about the banks, the churches, all these things that are malpractice of institutions. A lot of the information for journalists comes from whistleblowers. So I'm saying to you, do we need, Monica, Peter, do we need to revamp laws in regard to prevent this happening?
Revamp laws?
Fight the laws.
Well, I mean, I think what's become really clear in the last year is that we have. It's become clear to the public, journalists have known it for much longer than that we have a raft of national security laws, some 63 or 64 of them, I think is the figure, which have the capacity to impinge upon the work of journalists and impact the kind of journalism that they do. So there is a degree of overreach that the government has yet to commit to redressing and pulling back. And so that's one of the issues. It is having a chilling effect. I think the new chair of the ABC, Ita Buttrose, was on record as saying just last week that the ABC has lost several stories because whistleblowers have suddenly decided that they're too frightened to go and speak. And so you would imagine that impact will continue as the months wear on. So do we need laws to protect us specifically? Wouldn't that be lovely? It'd be lovely to think that we could have a media freedom bill. I doubt it will happen. There will be people who will argue that journalists shouldn't be a species aside who deserve particular protection that is not available to, your ordinary blogger or your social media activist who's there on Twitter doing the work of a journalist, i.e. conveying information and in some cases analysing it. And filtering it. So there will be considerable opposition to a media freedom bill. But the least that we can expect and the least that we can demand is that there be some curtailing of the current raft of legislation that inhibits what we do.
Well, I agree with what Monica said. I think we should all be aware that these two cases you mentioned, the press raids on the ABC and the Annika Smethurst, were both actually conducted under the Crimes Act, which is 100 years old. So we can talk about the new legislation, but that's the Crimes Act, peeps. It's the Crimes Act. So I do think this is a political question. Ultimately, this is a political question, and the question really is, does the Attorney General and then the Prime Minister the will to act? And that will only, and it's an interesting time. We have two inquiries, two parliamentary committees looking at these questions, one controlled by the government and one controlled by essentially the Greens and the minor parties. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. I do think there has been, and I don't think Labor Party blemish in this either. A lot of legislation has gone through with bipartisan support. There's a new function called these journalism information warrants, which are these incredibly secret tools that a raft of government agencies, not just the AFP and ASIO, those sorts of places, an incredible number of government agencies can apply to get a journalism information warrant, which the journalist in concern and the employer of that journalist does not know that is happening until someone arrives and knocks on your door. So we are living in very uncharted territory at this point, I think.
We do have an area where the government could tighten things up, and that's with the defamation laws. Australia apparently is the defamation capital of the world. We have double the number of defamation cases compared to the UK, where the laws are much more free speech friendly. And according to the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, nearly 30% of journalist stories are regularly spiked because of fear of defamation.
That's a big number. I'm not sure about that number, but anyway, yes, what you say is true, though, Ros. And New South Wales, by the way, is the defamation capital of this country, in part because a lot of people are using the federal court in this state, and lawyers in the room can talk about that. But what we have seen, there's a couple of things that have happened recently. We've seen these massive payouts. So there was an effort. There's been an ongoing effort to try and uniform defamation laws, to limit and cap the size of the payouts. But what's happened is that there's this aggravated damages sort of loophole. So we've seen these massive payouts to the likes of Rebel Wilson and Geoffrey Rush and et cetera, et cetera. One of the key differences that we struggle with is this notion of qualified privilege. So one of your protections against defamation as a journalist is this idea that you acted in good faith and you took all the available steps to make sure that what you published or broadcast was true. And the judiciary is currently taking a very, very narrow view of qualified privilege and knocking it out, basically. And we really are struggling to use that as a defense. The UK actually has a much broader definition of qualified privilege, and it's much easier to get. And that explains one of the reasons. The other reason I should add for everyone in this room is that one of the reasons why defamation is going through the roof is that ordinary people are suing each other over Facebook posts and such like. So about roughly a third of defamation cases, and it's growing, is essentially neighbours suing neighbours. So this is the world we live in, right? This is the world we live in when journalists are not the only people who can claim to be, journalists. This is the dangerous territory we live in.
Well, yes. Can we have I think we've already had your crystal ball, Peter, about new models you see for how people can see the stories they want to see without being driven into echo chambers and silos where they're presented with selected facts.
Well, I'll just say one final thing about that, and it's about choice, really. It's about becoming active media consumers again. The filter bubble problem really arises when you're passive, when you allow Facebook to decide what you read. So the way to get out of filter bubble is be more active. But
Facebook knows even when you're active, even when you're actively choosing what you want to consume, Facebook knows that.
Yes.
And then they algorithmically contort your feed to reflect that.
So get off of Facebook.
So get off Facebook. Yeah. The number of times when I've had conversations with students and I say, so now do we, how across the news are we, gang? What are we reading? And they go, I read everything. Really? What do you read? Everything on my Facebook feed. Yeah. You just want to cry. But I mean, getting off Facebook for starters, because that is, I think, so much damage is being done at that point.
Mhm.
Yeah, sorry, Andrew.
No?
No, you're right. I mean, yes, get off Facebook and start paying for news.
Yeah. And as Monica has brought up, educating the next generation of journalists and audiences. So, Monica, in this space, you're head of journalism. What can we do to make sure that the current crop of journalism students are going to set sail for calmer waters?
Well, it's a really big question, and it's a really hard one to answer. But and I could do it in kind of dot form. But I mean, I think it's ensuring that they leave us on an editorial front, that they leave us understanding the difference between fact and opinion. One of the things that I've noticed in this current crop is that they cannot distinguish between fact and opinion. And that is because for the last 10 years of their probably active consumption of news and information, they've been exposed to an awful lot of opinion. So it's trying to kind of beat that out of them, which is a really big task and a challenge. It's getting them to understand as well the public interest value which is attached to their role, and that their job is not to act as a PR executive or a PR advocate for whatever cause, but they're the only people for whom they should be acting as an advocate is the public. And that may well have always been the challenge of teaching journalism, but for me it feels like a much bigger and deeper challenge now. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing about the opinion? Because I think there really is a very worrying trend here and we've seen this right across the board for all media companies, so I'm criticising the media companies here, that because opinion has a tendency to engage people, because largely opinion is designed to outrage people. Most media companies, and no one is really immune to this, from The Guardian to The Australian and all points in between, including, dare I say, the ABC, you get clickbait, right? And one of the ways journalism is rewarded is by eyeballs and clicks and shares. Mm-hmm. And therefore, a lot of media companies, as I mentioned, nearly all of them, are privileging opinion over fact-based reporting, and that is a slippery slope.
I mean, I don't want to be overly defensive of the ABC, but the ABC doesn't at least do that. I mean, they dallied with opinion. They dallied with opinion in the drum online, and then they abandoned it, which is a good thing. So they have realised the error of their ways on that front. I mean, there's a little bit of opinion
I think a lot of opinion creeps into if you go to the ABC app and you go, top stories, you'll get 5 stories of news, and then there'll be some opinion piece sitting there.
Yeah, but at least it'll be by an expert. But I think the bigger problem with opinion at the ABC is actually on air. So programs like The Drum, which are designed to be opinion-based programs. But online, I think they're slightly more respectable on that front. But as Peter said, the problem is that every other aspect of media has been looking for a cheap and easy way to get clicks, 17 cents worth of advertising that might deliver, and that's their business model.
I think that's an absolute perfect time for us now to invite questions from the audience.